All right, this is the sixth lecture of Philo of Alexandria, philosopher, mystic, and defender of his people by Rabbi Lawrence Troster. And this morning is the November 5th, and it's the seventh of an 8-part series. So we are going back to talk about what we started last time, which was ideas about what's called the Logos. And we had looked at Genesis 1, and we talked quite a bit about the fact is that the beginning of Genesis does not posit the idea of creation from nothing, something from nothing, creation ex nihilo. Genesis 1 is not really interested in the question of that. There is a primordial tohu vavohu that exists at the beginning of creation, out of which God forms the universe. And this was a very common idea in the ancient world, and is revealed in other earlier creation texts in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, that predate Genesis 1. Just because Genesis 1 is at the beginning of the Bible doesn't mean it's the oldest. In fact, it's the latest version of creation, probably coming out of the experience in the Babylonian exile, ultimately. I mean, its final version, it may be older than that, but nonetheless. And in fact, some people see it as a polemic against the Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish. The Torah, the writers of the creation stories in the Hebrew Bible are really interested in how did order come out of chaos. That's really their issue. What is the divine order? Is there a divine order? Why does this disorder get disrupted? Because if there is perfect divine order, then evil should not flourish, and all that kind of thing. So that issue is not something that they are concerned with. By the time of the Jews of Alexandria and the translation of the Torah into Greek, you begin to see the emergence of an idea which comes from Greek philosophy, that there is an intermediary between God and creation called the Logos. Now, the idea that there are intermediaries or other divine beings, of course, goes right back to the Bible itself. It's not a big deal. There's angels, the planets, the stars. But this is something different. This is, you might say, the Logos is the agent by which God's power is manifested on the earth. Now, the word Logos means word, and of course, it's used by the author of the Gospel of John, and in the very first chapter of the Gospel of John. And in the beginning was the Word, and what the author of that is doing is quoting something which is, if you take out the Christ part of it a little later on, is a perfectly good Jewish idea at the time. So where does this Logos come from? Because the Logos is important in Philo, and he has a very strong, and he develops the idea considerably. You actually see the beginnings of this idea in the late parts of the Bible itself. And the most critical text, and what I gave you on the sheet that I handed out last time was the notion, I gave you this text from Deuteronomy translated into Greek in the Septuagint, and I bolded the words Logos, and different declension, it's logos, to show you that they were, by the time of the Septuagint, they were already beginning to see the word Logos, not just as a translation for word, but for something more than that. And but the idea really gets started, I don't want to say gets started. I'm going to say the first evidence of it in the Bible, in a significant way, is in the 8th chapter of the book of Proverbs. And if you turn to the 8th chapter of Proverbs, which is on page 1611 in the Tanakh, the first 9 chapters of the book of Proverbs is a prologue that was added later to the book. In other words, it's sort of a later strand of the book. The book of Proverbs is an anthology of all kinds of aphorisms coming out of what we call the wisdom school, meaning it's not like if the Torah is really primarily the ultimate product of the priests, and then you have the prophetic books from the prophets, you have what's in the Hebrew Bible a series of books and material which we call wisdom literature. This comes out of the scribes, the ones who were literate. And the wisdom tradition was an international phenomenon. There's wisdom literature in all the ancient Near Eastern cultures, predating the Israelites by thousands of years, to the point where there's even a part of the book of Proverbs which is a direct quote from an Egyptian book of Proverbs that's over 1,000 years older. The compilers of Proverbs didn't know that that's where they got it from. They probably got it from an intermediary Aramaic translation. But nonetheless, the wisdom school was cosmopolitan. It was about virtue. Well, it was about how to achieve happiness and live the good life. It had very practical advice. A lot of it came out of court circles, or in some case, in Egypt, it came out of the priestly circles. In other words, the literate elite. And some of it is folk wisdom, meaning kind of village wisdom on things like agriculture and things like that, common kind of folk sayings. But other is cosmological speculation, existential attempts to try and understand one's place in the universe. The entire book of Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, it's a wisdom book, and it's primarily dealing with that issue. But in the process, there's a lot of, again, aphorisms and proverbs and things like that in Ecclesiastes. The book of Job is a wisdom book. There's also about a dozen of the Psalms are from the wisdom school. But the main book is the book of Proverbs. Again, as I said, it's an anthology. It's been edited over centuries. Some of it is earlier than later, and the first 9 chapters is a prologue. And one of the things that's quite fascinating is in chapter 8, wisdom itself, chokhmah in Hebrew, gives a soliloquy. Now, chokhmah in Hebrew is feminine, because all words are either masculine or feminine. So chokhmah becomes, in this soliloquy, a female figure, Lady Wisdom. And she gives this soliloquy, and she begins by crying out to men, this is primarily directed at men, to follow her. And in the first part of it, she talks about, why you should and some of her characteristics, if you're starting in verse 12 on the next page. But then, in verse 22, begins a passage of fascinating cosmology. Irma, do you want to start reading? This is on page 1612, verse 22.
The Lord created me at the beginning of his course, as the first of his works of old. In the distant past I was fashioned, at the beginning, at the origin of earth. There was still no deep when I was brought forth, no springs rich in water. Before the foundation of the mountains were sunk, before the hills I was born. He had not yet made earth and fields, or the world's first clumps of clay. I was there when he set the heavens into place, when he fixed the horizon upon the deep, when he made the heavens above firm and the fountains of the deep gushed forth, when he assigned the sea its limits so that the waters never transgress his command, when he fixed the foundations of the earth. I was with him as a confidant, a source of delight every day. Rejoicing before him at all times, rejoicing in his inhabited world, finding delight with mankind.
Okay, stop there, because then she goes on and talks about that if you follow wisdom, you will be happy. The Hebrew word is ashrei, right? Okay, so this is quite interesting. This is the cosmological kind of account here is very similar to earlier texts, but that are not like Genesis 1, but there are a lot of similarities. You see the idea that the deep, right, which is in Genesis 1, chapter 1, verse 2, is the primordial water. So you start with the water, then the land. This follows what you have in Genesis, but because we're only dealing with the earth, we're not dealing with the heavens here yet. Talking about fixing the horizon, that's the rakia, that's the firmament, right? The fountains of the deep, assigned the seas its limit. This is very similar to Psalm 104, where you also have a little creation story at the beginning, and also from parts of Job, and fixing the foundations of the earth, the pillars of the earth. So here you have this very short account of creation, but notice, what does wisdom say? Where was she, what does she say at the beginning?
She was there before everything.
She was there even before it started. That before there was creation itself, there was chokhmah. Now, then what does she say? I was with him as an amon. This can be translated in a number of ways. Can be kind of companion, confidant. What does it sound like? It sounds like almost a partner in creation. It's on the borderline there. A source of delight every day, rejoicing before him. There is a kind of, this is something that there's a tremendous amount of text written on. Finding delight. In other words, that wisdom, in a way, makes God happy. God's having fun. That the creation process is a positive one, right? And finding delight in humankind. Now, is this just a parable? Is this hyperbole and rhetoric? What is the author of this passage talking about? That's something that people argue about. Is wisdom a independent celestial being that is, this is the most radical part, that is a co-creator with God? Because it's feminine, it harkens back to the notion that God had a female consort? Or is that too far? Does that go too far? And are we talking about here taking the concept of chokhmah and for rhetorical purposes, giving her a personality and using her as a rhetorical device? That means that chokhmah is the design of the universe. That before God creates the universe, God has to, within God's self, so to speak, have the plans. And chokhmah represents the deep structure of the universe. And in fact, the rabbis, this idea goes for a very long time, and eventually chokhmah, I'll get to you, Paul. Eventually, chokhmah is identified with Torah itself, because Torah and chokhmah are not the same at this time. But eventually, there may be little texts in the Bible itself that begin to see this transition, but you really see it in the book of Ben Sira in the early 2nd century BCE, where chokhmah and Torah have now become the same thing. And the rabbis have a very famous midrash at the beginning of the midrash on Genesis that in effect says, just like an architect, a king has an architect before he builds a building, so that it's all drawn out and planned. God created the Torah first, that the Torah predates creation, and God looked into the Torah and there created the universe. So my feeling is I'm kind of not convinced by the goddess thing, and I think that this is a rhetorical device to talk about the notion of deep design, because I think there's other texts that suggest that, there is a sense of divine design to the universe. But you can understand why, if you don't take this as rhetoric, it would seem that Chokhmah can almost be seen as an intermediary agent of creation through which God creates the universe. That the Chokhmah is a semi-independent divine being which acts as God's, not only the design, but actually helps to build the universe itself. Paul, you had a point.
Yeah, but you're humanizing God, and I don't think that's correct, because you said God has a mate, and you're humanizing God, which I don't think is correct.
Well, that's because our concepts of God today don't have this notion of God being like a being in the same way as a human, but in the Bible, God is a very human-like. And so, we talked about that in one of our earlier courses about God had a body and all this kind of stuff. Our concepts of God have changed a lot since the time of the Bible. Okay? I mean, the whole idea of angels and intermediaries and all kinds of things was very well developed at this time. Harvey, you had a question.
It seems to me that if logos is wisdom, or no,
Well, we're going to get there.
that we have something corporeal. There has to be a corporeal being.
Well, it depends on what you mean by corporeal. In other words, it's not made out of
Physical person.
not the physical matter of which we're made out of. Okay? In other words, in the Greek cosmology, once you get past the moon, you don't have the same kind of matter that you do below the moon. So this is above the lunar sphere, where the beings that occupy it are increasingly what we would call spiritual beings made out of spiritual matter, rather than fire, air, earth, and water.
So it's like a lunacy.
It's a what?
Lunacy.
Lunacy. That's good. Okay. Let's take a look at another text which is interesting in this, and that's the 28th chapter of the book of Job, which is, this is on page 1698. The 20th chapter of the book of Job is probably, again, a later addition to the book than the original, or whatever. It's probably one of the last things added to the book. It has really very little to do with the story. It's kind of an intrusion into the action, but it is a beautiful a passage on the nature of wisdom. It's about contrasting wisdom with earthly goods. And it's it's really, the question is in verse 12, where can wisdom be found? What is the source of understanding? And anyway, if you take a look in verse 22, look at verse 12. It talks about this idea that it's not found in the land of the living. In other words, it's not in the earthly realm. And it's not in the lower realm, Sheol, the realm which is when in verse 22, when it says Abaddon, that's the equivalent of Sheol, the place of death. It's not to be found there. Well, where is it? It's with God. So this has it's not like the Proverbs passage, but in effect it's saying that Chokhmah is not something that's on the earth. Okay, it lies with God. Okay, so if you take a look at the material I gave you last week, you will see that something interesting happens. You remember that at the beginning of Genesis, Our translation says, when God began to create the heavens and the earth, right? Old translation, in the beginning God created heaven and the earth. Okay, so what's the first word of Genesis 1 in Hebrew? Bereshit, right. Which the B is the when, right? Sometimes B means in. Sometimes, if it actually meant in the beginning, it would have been ba, reshit, because ba is beit plus ha, which means in the, right? The word reshit is beginning, coming from the root rosh, meaning head. So something that is the head is the top, but also the beginning, like Rosh Chodesh, right? The new moon, new month, Rosh Hashanah, so on and so forth. So, Bereshit, we translate the when, and then the verb is, it's Bereshit bara, so the verb follows that. So we translate it as when, and then the subject is Elohim, Bereshit bara Elohim, right? When God began to create, and then the object et hashamayim v'et haaretz. But the word be can also mean by means of. By means of. So, if you take it that meaning, you can translate it as, by means of Reshit, did God begin to create the universe. So, what is Reshit? What is Reshit? Well, you could just say, it's begin. It doesn't work if it means beginning, does it? But in Job 28, is it in Job 28? Actually, it's at the beginning of. No, it's at the beginning of the book of Proverbs. If you look at the beginning of the book of Proverbs, 1599. I think that's where it comes from. Yes. Verse 7 is really in some ways the title of the entire book. Yirat Adonai Reshit Da'at Chochma Umusar, and so on. The fear of wisdom is the beginning of knowledge. There's another passage somewhere else which the text, exact text is eluding me, which basically says the beginning of wisdom is fear of the Lord. Reshit Chochma. Okay?
That wasn't just after what I read.
Yeah, you're right.
Sorry.
So I thought I had it right the first time. That in Job 28, hang on. No, it's not quite there. I don't think the phrase is there. I think it's somewhere else in the book of Proverbs. But the point is, there's a place where it says Reshit, Reshit Chochma, the beginning of wisdom is fear of the Lord. It's probably it's another passage in Proverbs, I'm sure. So Reshit means Chochma. So Bereshit means by means of wisdom did God create the universe. Now, that understanding, of course, is not reflected in the Bible itself. Yes, Irma.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's 9:10. The beginning of wisdom.
Proverbs 9:10.
Yeah.
Okay, so Proverbs 9:10. Thank you for finding it. Which is on page 1614. Well, here it's Tehillat Chochma. It's not Reshit Chochma, but nonetheless, that basically means the same thing. But in another place, it definitely says Reshit Chochma. And so there was an understanding that started that understood that first verse of Genesis to mean, by means of wisdom did God create. And this is where Proverbs chapter 8 has begun to have an influence in a more literal way, that Chochmah is the agent or the means by which God creates the universe. Now, you can look at it as a plan, or you can look at it as a divine being. And this is reflected in the Targums. The Targums are the Aramaic translations to the Torah, to the Hebrew Bible, and all translations are interpretations. The standard Targum, Targum-Onkelos, is the most literal, but even there it leans towards rejecting anthropomorphisms. This is the material from last week that I'm looking at. Here. This is it. And so one of the Targums, Targum Yerushalmi, actually translates Bereshit bara Elohim as Bechuchma bara Adonai. With wisdom, or by means of wisdom, the Lord created. Now, in other places, that begins to evolve into a different word, where every time the word appears, it uses the Aramaic word memar. Memar is the exact Aramaic equivalent to the Greek logos. So even in the non-Greek understandings of these biblical texts, you begin to see that davar, the Hebrew word davar, which means thing but can also mean word, is beginning to be translated as memar. And in some cases, what's happening is that the word that God is being added to with God's memar, as opposed to just God. Okay? So the example I gave you was Exodus 3, chapter 12. If you take a look at that. This is the passage of the burning bush. On page 117. It says, and he, meaning God, said, I will be with you, that this shall be a sign that it was I who sent you. And when you have freed the people from Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain. Well, in effect, it puts in the word memar in there. It says God's memar will be with you. God's logos. Okay? So what you see is a very common idea that has emerged in the Second Temple period, which is common to both Aramaic-speaking Jews and Greek-speaking Jews, that God had an intermediary, a kind of more than an angel, which was God's agent to create the universe and to continue to actualize God's creative power. In other words, the Logos is constantly at work. Yes, Harvey, you're looking a little troubled there.
I am. I spoke before about it being something tangible, a physical being.
Yeah.
But yet, you're saying that it's really a wisp, a cloud.
Well, no, not even a cloud. I mean, is God a physical being? No. What is God? God is made out of the highest, purest form of, I hesitate even to use the word spiritual matter. The Logos is not quite as like God, but it is God-like. It comes close. Just as the planets and the stars are angelic celestial beings, they are not made of matter, air, fire, earth, or water. They're made of something that is more, we would call abstract or spiritual. So is the Logos. It's not a physical being in the way we understand the word. Yes, Harvey, did you have one last thing you want to say?
I'm confused, but go ahead.
What are you confused about?
The concept. It's nothing that we have learned, I have learned.
Well, tell me, what is a quark? Right. In other words, when you go into the subatomic world of atoms, they're not matter in the way we understand matter, are they?
That's exactly my point.
Yeah.
I'm from matter school.
I understand that. I understand that. But the existence is a lot stranger than we can physically perceive. And so they had an idea. Of course, they didn't know about quarks, obviously, but they had this idea that if the Earth is at the center of the universe and there are these spheres, shells that surround the Earth, each one above the moon becomes increasingly, again, I'm going to use the word more spiritual, meaning less matter-like. And the Logos is one of these. Yeah,
I have
Irma.
a much simpler question.
Yeah.
I can't find Mamar in the.
It's not there. It's not in the Bible.
Oh, I see.
It's an Aramaic translation.
Okay.
In other words,
Okay.
it's a targum. And the Mamar is the Aramaic equivalent to Logos.
Okay. So in this translation, what would
Mamar is put in. Mamar is put in.
Not there at all.
No, it's not there at all. In other words, they will say where it might say in a verse God did this, they will
Yes.
say God's. The
Mamar.
translation will be God's Mamar. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So let's look a little bit at what Philo has to say about the Logos. And so we're going to look at a text called "Who is the Heir of Divine Things" on page 293. Number 205, which is found on 293 on the right side. And who wants to read? Somebody jump in. Okay. Cal? Okay.
And the Father who created the universe has given to his archangel and most ancient word a preeminent gift to stand on the confines of both, and separated that which had been created from the Creator. And the same word is continually a suppliant to the immortal God on behalf of the mortal race, which is exposed to affliction and misery, and is also the ambassador sent by the ruler of all to the subject race.
There it is. This word, that's the Logos.
Yeah.
Because the word Logos can mean word, right? So what is the function of the Logos according to this? It is the intermediary between God and humanity. In other words, Philo would say it's the by means which revelation, God's word, comes to us, right? When God speaks, it comes through the Logos because God doesn't speak, doesn't have a mouth, doesn't speak in the normal sense. So in a way, it kind of has to be filtered, like the Logos is an ambassador, but also the Logos is the means by which we get to God, meaning prayer. Yeah.
How about the word vehicle? It's the vehicle by which.
You could say vehicle, but he's using the word ambassador, interestingly enough. That's his analogy here, right? You don't get to see the king, but you can talk to the ambassador, and the ambassador will talk to God, and then come back with the message, right? Okay, read on. And the word.
And the word rejoices in the gift, and exulting in it, announces it and boasts of it, saying, And I stood in the midst between the Lord and you.
That's in the original text. That's actually not referring to, anything. It's referring to a human being. I think it's either Aaron or Moses. Yes.
Neither being uncreate as God, nor yet created as you, but being in the midst between these two extremities, like a hostage, as it were, to both parties, a hostage to the Creator, as a pledge and security that the whole race would never fly off and revolt entirely, choosing disorder rather than order, and to the creature, to lead it to entertain a confident hope that the merciful God would not overlook his own work. For I will proclaim peaceful intelligence to the creation from him who has determined to destroy wars, namely God, who is ever the guardian of peace. Therefore the sacred word, having given us instruction respecting the division into equal parts, leads us also to the knowledge of opposites, saying that God placed the divisions opposite to one another. For in fact, nearly all the things that exist in the world are by nature opposite to one another. And we must begin with the first.
Okay, we'll stop there. One of the things that let's see. I want to check one of the translation here with a different translation. He doesn't use another better way instead of hostage is the word pledge rather than hostage. Hostage is a little strange. So here it is, and in fact he even has the Logos speak. So, and he, therefore the sacred word, again, the Logos having given us instruction. So for him, the Torah represents that, the message that comes through the Logos. All right, let's take a look at one other text on the Logos. He has quite a few of them. And by the way, Philo's not 100% consistent in his writings on exactly what he means by this. But if you go to page 405, this is book 2 of On Dreams, which is number 242. Which is on the right side of page 405. Sorry, page 405. And number 242. Cal, why don't you read a little more? By the name, everybody have it? On the right side, page 405, number 242. And by the name.
And by the name Eden, he means the wisdom of the living God. And the interpretation of the name Eden is delight, because I imagine wisdom is the delight of God, and God is the delight of wisdom, as it is said also in the Psalms, delight thou in the Lord. And the divine word, like a river, flows forth from wisdom as from a spring, in order to irrigate and fertilize the celestial and heavenly shoots and plants of such souls as love virtue. And if they were a paradise. As if they were a paradise. And the sacred word is divided into 4 beginnings, by which I mean it is portioned out into 4 virtues, each of which is a princess, for to be divided into beginnings does not resemble divisions of place, but a kingdom, in order that anyone, after having shown the virtues as boundaries, may immediately proceed to show the wise man who follows them to be king, being elected as such, not by men, but by the only free nature which cannot err, and which cannot be corrupted.
Okay, let's stop there. What he's saying here is, and the divine word, like a river, flows forth from wisdom. So the word that we get through Moses, the revelation comes through wisdom, which in Greek is Sophia, which is the translation of Chokhmah, which is the Logos. So Chokhmah equals Sophia equals Logos. Okay? And he's talking about texts in Psalms. He's referring to Genesis chapter 2, verse 10, where it talks about the primordial river from the Garden of Eden. When it flows out, it goes into the 4 major rivers of the ancient Near East, 2 of which we're not 100% sure they are, but one is Tigris and the other is Euphrates. And if we were to go on to the next paragraph, it talks about how divine speech is like a river. All right, and so if you go down to the bottom of the page, it says, but it seems he's looking at he's quoting a verse from Psalm 65. But as it seems, the psalmist is here speaking of the divine word, which is full of streams and wisdom, which it has no part of itself, empty or desolate, as someone has said, which is diffused everywhere over the universe, and so on and so forth. So this is showing you how Philo has this idea in his cosmological structure, which has been long established in the Jewish community, coming from Greek culture, that there is this intermediary being between God and the material world, which is the Logos, which serves the function of both transmitting God's revelation to us, functioning, as it were, as an ambassador from us back to God, but is also the mechanism, and I hesitate to use the word mechanism, but the means by which God's creative power flows to the universe. Because Philo believes that God's creation is ongoing, that it's not a singular act, but a process that continues at every moment. And this idea, of course, will find quite, this becomes a normative Jewish idea. You see it in rabbinic literature. It's in our liturgy. In the morning service, it says God renews creation every day in the Shacharit service. And you see it in Maimonides. You see it especially in Kabbalah. This notion that that creation is an ongoing process. Yes, Harvey, you look like you have a question.
Just a comment that, with the flow of nature, like you see now, that the falling leaves, the rebirth in the spring, constantly
Yes.
creating itself.
Yeah, and I think that in the Bible itself, there is this idea that the earth reflects a kind of ongoing creative process, because just as the earth is the agent by which plants and animals come into existence, not humans, so the earth, by its fertility, bringing up grass for animals and humans to eat, and so on and so forth, and crops, is in a certain sense, I think, the ongoing agent of God's creation. But it's different than what Philo's talking about. Philo's talking more like about, I'm going to use the analogy, electricity. A flow of electricity that keeps things moving. A flow of power, of energy.
You never see electricity.
Yeah, well, you don't see the divine flow either. It's reflected in the birth of humans, animals, plants growing, and so on and so forth. And there is, in a way, a very intimate relationship between this divine flow of energy and revelation. All right? Okay, so let's go. We're going to look now at his work on the creation itself, which is starts on page 3, practically right at the beginning of our book. And before we get into that, I just want to, I gave you this piece, I sent it out online. If not, I've got copies I made copies of it, which is about Plato's cosmology. And Plato's cosmology mostly is found in his work, the Timaeus, which is written around 360 BCE, and it's a dialogue. Timaeus is one of the people. It's one of the two works of Plato where Atlantis is mentioned. But the main part of the Timaeus is really about Plato's ideas on cosmology, or more perfectly accurate, cosmogony, meaning how did the universe come into existence? So take a look at this. Plato, of course, believed that there are two elements of the universe. There is the world of forms, and there is the physical world. And the world of forms is non-material, and it is the word of being. In other words, the forms are eternal. They don't change. And everything that is in the physical world, which is the world of becoming, because it is coming into being, it exists, then it passes away. It is the world that is grasped by our senses, but the world of forms can only be grasped by rational thought and understanding, not by the senses. And the cosmos, the physical world, and the word cosmos in Greek means order. The order of the universe comes into being and the model on which the templates, I'm going to use that, the templates for everything in the cosmos are the world of forms. So there is, as it were, a form in the world of forms of a pyramid, but that mathematical shape, or a sphere. So everything that is a physical pyramid shape or a sphere, like a ball, is a physical manifestation based on the template of the divine forms. And anybody who studied Plato knows this is one of the essential ideas of it. Now, Plato also has this idea that there is something that is called the demiurge, which is the creator of the cosmos. It's not the highest god. It's a kind of it's a sub god that is the agent by which the physical world is made, and he compares it to a manual laborer. So that is the equivalent of what becomes for Philo the Logos. The physical world is made up of elements that have a body. They have to be visible, they have to be tangible, and they're made up of fire, air, earth, and water. Those are the four basic elements by which all matter in the, below the lunar sphere in the physical world are made up of. So that's the matter. But how does something get a form? Well, again, the world of the forms supplies the template for everything that is made up of the physical matter. So one of these chairs are made up of earthly matter. But there is a divine form for a chair. And all physical chairs are based on the template of the form of the chair. And you cannot perceive the form of the chair. You can only infer it by understanding. So if we look at any chair, what are its kind of basic features that all chairs have? Well, it's got to be something you sit on. Okay? So even though you can have all kinds of different chairs, there is a kind of basic form of chair. Mm-hmm. And everything in the physical world has one of these. Of course, we have a lot more stuff than they did in Plato's day. So there's a lot more forms necessary. And the other thing is, if you go down to the bottom of this page, I've given you, there are some features of the cosmos. In a certain sense, it is a living thing itself. It's spherical because spheres were considered in the ancient world to be the most perfect form. It's temporal, meaning within the material cosmos, there is time. But God and the world of the forms is not temporal. It's outside of times. So, according to Plato, however, the cosmos cannot be eternal because it's made of matter, which is constantly changing. So, for Plato, therefore, that means there has to be a coming into being constantly of the material world. Now, Plato believes that, in a way, that this comes out of a primordial matter. We don't have to look at the rest of this. You can go to the website. It actually goes on further than what I've given you to describe other elements of the cosmos. This is what Philo was working with. This is the world. And as I mentioned last time, there were essentially two cosmologies. There was Plato's, where there is this, primordial stuff, and the matter as a kind of primordial building material. And there is the forms, the design, and the universe constantly comes into being out of this chaos. But for Plato, there's no creation of the matter. In other words, the matter is eternal. There's no beginning to this process because the concept of beginning is temporal, and the world of the forms is outside of temporal, and the existence of matter itself is outside of temporal. It's only when the matter is made into forms, in other words, there can be no creation ex nihilo, creation from nothing in Plato. Aristotle, however, says there's this idea that somehow there is this original primordial matter. No, there isn't. The universe is eternal in its structure, and that's it. So, again, if you want to look at how a Jewish philosopher in a lot more systematic way than Philo grapples with this issue, you look in the Guide of the Perplexed by Maimonides, and he gives you three theories of cosmology or cosmogony. He says there's Aristotle that says there is no beginning whatsoever. There is Plato that says there is primordial matter out of which the universe is created. So primordial matter coexists with God before God begins to create. And then there is the biblical tradition, which by his day believed that they understood to be creation out of nothing. He says the biblical one is there is only God originally, and then God creates the universe. And in effect, most people believe he's very difficult to understand sometimes in the guide, and by the way, he does that intentionally, because he doesn't want your average person to really understand. You've got to be smart. Just a minute, Paul. Maimonides says the Jewish doctrine is creation out of nothing. We have to accept that because that's the way we understand the Torah. If we didn't have the Torah, we would accept Plato. And there is a suggestion that he's, fudging his own beliefs here, that he really accepts the Platonic view rather than the notion of creation from nothing, which from a physical perspective in his day is somewhat miraculous. It's outside the natural process because he kind of accepts the idea that the Greeks understood that nothing can come. You can't get something from nothing, which is what Plato in effect is saying. Yes, Paul? Okay. So that's what Philo's working with. He's reacting to it. He's reacting to Plato. Even while he's within the Platonic system, he's also reacting a little to Aristotle. And he's also reacting to the notions of God in his day from people like Epicurus, the Epicureans, who say that the gods exist, but they have no interaction with humanity. And the Epicureans were called atheists because they, in effect, for all practical purposes, it was claimed they didn't believe in the gods. They didn't believe that the gods, the gods existed, but they didn't care, didn't know, didn't connect. So for, all practical purposes, they don't exist. So that's really what he's struggling with. And he's trying to reconcile the biblical account of Genesis 1, by which the way he understood it in his day, with the Platonic view. That's really what he's doing in this book. We're not going to read the whole thing because he goes off at one point into this whole numerological stuff. But in effect, what he does is he goes through Genesis chapter 1, virtually line by line, and then he goes through Genesis chapter 2. So he looks at what we consider the two creation stories in the beginning of Genesis, and he is dealing with this stuff from his perspective. So we're going to begin right at the beginning. Because first of all, he deals with the issue of why does the Torah start with the creation story, which is, by the way, the first comment of Rashi many centuries later. So, Harvey, do you want to begin? It says, of other lawgivers. Well, actually, we don't have to start with number 1. Start with number 3.
Where are you?
On page 3 of the book. On the creation. Start with, and his exordium. Yeah, there's no number at the bottom. If you'll flip over the page, you'll see page 4 at the top. But it's the very beginning of On the Creation.
And what's the beginning paragraph number?
I want you to start with paragraph 3.
And his exordium?
Yep.
And his exordium, as I have already said, is most admirable, embracing the creation of the world, under the idea that the law corresponds in the world, and the world is the law.
Corresponds to.
Is that why you gave me this to read?
Yeah. No. And the law here, the Greek is nomos, right? Okay. Go on.
And that a man who is obedient to the law, being by so
Doing.
A citizen of the world.
A cosmopolitas. A citizen of the cosmos. Meaning, go on, arranges his actions.
His actions with reference to the intention of nature, in harmony with which the whole universal world is regulated.
So we'll stop there for a second. He says the reason why Moses puts the creation at the beginning is because underlying, before all the laws that Moses gives us, there is an underlying universal law of the cosmos, translated here as nature. All right? And but in Greek it's cosmos. So it should really be translated as cosmos, or left as cosmos. But that's what they meant by, he means by the whole of the natural world, that if you learn the underlying laws of the universe, that in effect makes you a cosmopolitan, a citizen of the cosmos, and this is an important step in learning how to live the good life. So that's the reason for the stories of Genesis at the beginning of the Torah. To give you, and now he's going to, in effect, tell you what these laws of the cosmos are by going through Genesis 1 and interpreting it for you. All right? So we're going to skip to number 7, which is on the right side, near the top. Keep going. For some men.
For some men, admiring the world itself rather than the creator of the world, have represented it as existing without any matter, any maker, and eternal, and then
Impiously.
as falsely have represented God as existing in a state of complete inactivity. While it would have been right on the other hand to marvel at the might of God as the creator and father of all, and to admire the world in a degree not exceeding the bounds of moderation.
So, what is he saying? There are people out there who say that the universe is eternal, it doesn't have a creator, and that God is existing in a state of complete inactivity. This is the Epicurean idea. And that is antithetical to Judaism, he says, in effect. And so he says, no, people admiring the world itself rather than the creator, which this translation doesn't use the word creator, but maker, interestingly enough. All right, you want to read on number 8?
But Moses, who had early reached the very summit of philosophy, and who had learned from the
oracles of God
the most numerous and important of the principles of nature, was well aware that that it is indispensable that in all existing things there must be an active cause and a passive subject.
Okay, stop there for a second. According to the common idea of the Jews of Alexandria and others influenced by Greek civilization, philosophy began with Moses and later came to the Greeks. The Jews forgot it, and therefore when we learn philosophy from the Greeks, it's really ancient Jewish wisdom. So they attribute, and this goes way before Philo, the idea that philosophy started with Moses, not Plato, not Aristotle, not Socrates. All right? And so this is part of the underlying idea, of course, that the Torah is actually reveals philosophy and its underlying principles, but Moses just uses other means of telling it. And notice it says there is all existing things must have a cause and a subject. Translated here, an active cause and the passive object. Read on, and that active
active cause is the intellect of the universe.
Translated here as in the later translation is mind, the mind of the universe. Go on.
Thoroughly unadulterated and thoroughly unmixed, superior in virtue and superior in science.
You translate that as knowledge.
Superior even to abstract good and abstract beauty.
He's talking here about the notion that God is the first cause of all. And the universe is the subject on which God acts. Meaning there is, an eternal universe without a maker, without a creator, has no cause. Okay? There has to be a first cause. And eventually this develops in the Middle Ages to what's called the cosmological proof for the existence of God. If everything has a cause, then that cause also has a cause. And if you go back, all the way back, there is a first cause. And that first cause has to be God. Maimonides uses that as his primary proof for the existence of God at the beginning of the Mishnah Torah, which we looked at if you took the class. That's called the cosmological proof for the existence of God. There's three classic proofs in the Middle Ages for the existence of God, and that's one of them. And by the way, the cosmological, the notion of a first cause is still being discussed. Stephen Hawking famously said, if the universe has a first cause, then that's God. Of course, it's not the God of the Bible, but nonetheless. And one of the things that cosmologists and physicists want to do is disprove the notion of a first cause. And that's where the multiverse that we talked about last time sort of gets away with that. If the universe is eternal, there is no first cause. It's an eternal process that has no beginning and has no end. All right, one more. Keep reading one last time. One more. While the passive subject...
Well, go ahead now. Me?
Yes,
Number 9.
Yeah, number 9. Just one
While
word.
the passive subject is something inanimate and incapable of motion by any intrinsic power of its own, but having been set in motion and fashioned and endowed with life by the intellect,
or mind, again, mind with a capital M,
became transformed into that most perfect work. This world...
That's the primordial matter. It's a lump. It's not of any shape. It's not animate. It is the mind that shapes it and turns it into a cosmos. Go on.
Would you say the mind is God then?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, the intellect. Again, the translation here, the newer translation I have, where you see intellect, it translates mind with a capital M. So you could put intellect with a capital N. It's God. God is the mind of the universe. Go on. And those who
describe it as being
uncreated
do, without being aware of it, cut off the most useful and necessary of all the qualities which tend to produce piety, namely prudence.
Providence. Okay. Bring the phone back up here. What does he mean by that? If you don't believe the universe was created, what does that mean?
You have to believe in God.
You might believe in a God that's so abstract and so disconnected from the world. What is the notion of providence? Providence is the concept of how does God relate to the world? If you don't have creation, God is not connected to the world, therefore you have no divine providence. In Hebrew, providence is hashgacha, and comes from and means look down upon. But essentially, providence is the way in which God interacts with the world. It's often referred to today as divine action. What is God? What is God actually doing in connection to the universe? It's still a very live and important question in theology. Okay, so he goes on, and he talks about in number 11, for example, he talks about the idea. He compares. This is at the bottom of the page. He talks about the idea that the universe is uncreated, and he uses an analogy of lack of laws in a city, an anarchy. Okay, and if you turn over the page, he basically says Moses, felt that something that is uncreated, as alien as possible from that which is visible towards our eyes. And if you look in number let's pick it up in number 13 for a bit. So Marianne, you want to pick it up? And he says that the world.
And he says that the world was made in 6 days, not because the Creator stood in need of the length of time, for it is natural that God should do everything at once, not merely by uttering a command, but even thinking of it, but because the things created required arrangement, and number is akin to arrangement, and of all numbers, 6 is, by the laws of nature, the most productive. For all the numbers, from the unit upwards, it is the first perfect one, being made equal to its parts, and being made complete by them. The number 3 being half of it, and the number 2 a third of it, and the unit is, meaning 1, a sixth of it.
Yeah.
And so to say, it is formed so as to be both male and female.
Okay, we can stop there. This is a little example of his numerology. His finding. Well, again, this is Pythagorean. Remember, right? That Pythagoras was very much interested in the relationship between the numbers, between mathematics and the physical universe, and of course that comes out in musical theory in Pythagoras as well. And by the way, again, that's a very interesting issue. What is the relationship between mathematical equations and the real world? Is mathematics just a numbers game, or does the universe, in effect, reflect some deep order that can be expressed in mathematical statements?
Numbers hold the world together.
Well, I once asked, this is an issue that I first read about in, I don't know if you know the work of Rebecca Goldstein. She's written novels. Her first one was called The Mind-Body Problem, but she's a professor of philosophy. And she wrote a wonderful book on the famous mathematician Gödel, who ended up at the Institute for Advanced Studies.
Princeton?
Not at Princeton University, in Princeton, New Jersey. There's no relationship between the university and the institute, interestingly enough. At the same time, Einstein was there, and they used to take walks together and talk about stuff. But the thing that the book is about is not only about their relationship, but she discusses what, Gödel's ideas, which were very revolutionary and very difficult for most people to understand, that in it she talks about the fact that mathematicians are of two types. There are those who believe that everything in math is essentially a numbers game, that it really has no ultimate reference to the world. But then there are those, and Gödel was one of them, who believe that mathematics represents some deep structure. In other words, they're Platonists. Yes.
Many years ago when I was in college, I was studying philosophy, and I loved it because it was Aristotle and Plato, and then the new professors that came in were total mathematicians.
Yes.
Everything was in terms of math,
Yes.
and I said, that's the end of it for me. But it was a major switch right at that point.
The reason is that because scientists believe that expressing, at least physicists do especially, you need to express something in mathematical formula because that's the only thing that transcends the problems of human language, which must use analogy and metaphor. In other words, the language of mathematics gave science a precise way to talk about the physical universe. But mathematicians themselves, where math has gone, it has become so abstract in some ways that, and I think this is actually the majority of mathematicians, because I asked a mathematician about this once. He said most of them don't believe that what they're doing has any essential relationship to the real world. Now, Gödel didn't believe that. And those who do, in effect, are Platonists. And I tend to like, obviously, the Platonists, the people like Gödel better, because what it means is there's some deep structure to the universe that, while it's not a proof of the existence of God, to me is very suggestive, I will use the word. And I like to, if you ever see some of my lectures on the environment, I like to mention the Fibonacci equation, which is a formula it's given in the name of an Italian mathematician who I believe in the 1200s named Fibonacci, but it actually precedes him, that you can express a spiral in a mathematical formula. In other words, if you plot it out on a graph, it turns into a beautiful spiral, and that in the natural world you find hundreds of examples of perfect Fibonacci curves. And that spiral, for example, exists in conch shells, snail shells. It's that curve. You see it in certain plants.
That's right, the tendrils.
Whirlpools in water, hurricanes.
Toilet flushing?
What? Yes, the toilet flushing, absolutely. Hurricanes are Fibonacci curve spirals, spiral galaxies. So here is something from the very small to the incredibly large. There is some kind of structure, deep structure, that can be expressed by a simple, and it's quite simple, mathematical formula. So that's why, Philo is fooling around with numbers, and when he gets to the Shabbat, he really goes nuts on the number 7. Okay, so we're gonna skip that, and let's go down to number 16 at the bottom of page 4. For God.
15.
Yeah, Mary.
Yeah, I got
going.
it.
Yeah.
For God, as apprehending beforehand, as a God must do, that there could not exist a good imitation without a good model, and that of the things perceptible to the eternal senses, nothing could be faultless which was not fashioned with reference to some archetypical idea conceived by the intellect. When he had determined to create this visible world, previously formed that one which is perceptible only by the intellect, in order that so using an incorporeal model, formed as far as possible on the image of God, he might then make this corporeal world a younger likeness of the elder creation, which should embrace as many different genera perceptible to the external senses as the other world contains of those which are visible only to the intellect.
Okay, and in this translation it says, he might have the use of a pattern, wholly godlike and incorporeal, in producing the material world as a later creation. The very image of an earlier, to embrace in itself the objects of perception. In other words, God created the pattern. These are the Platonic forms. This is where he connects up to the idea of Chokhmah being before creation. God creates the plans, the pattern, before the material world itself. Read on.
But that world which consists of ideas, it were impious in any degree to attempt to describe or even to imagine. But how it was created, we shall know if we take for our guide a certain image of the things which exist among us.
Meaning we can't actually physically perceive this world, so we have to understand it by analogy. This is the use of the intellect to perceive these ideas rather than the senses. And now he's going to give us the model, the analogy of the city. Read on.
When any city is founded through the exceeding ambition of some king or leader who lays claim to absolute authority and is at the same time a man of brilliant imagination, eager to display his good fortune, then it happens at times that some man coming up who from his education is skillful in architecture, and he, seeing the advantageous character and beauty of the situation, first of all sketches out in his own mind nearly all the parts of the city which is about to be completed, the temples, the gymnasia, the prytanea and markets, the harbor, the docks, the streets, the arrangement of the walls, the situations of the dwelling houses and of the public and other buildings.
The prytanea is the town hall.
Thank you. Then, having received in his own mind, as on a waxen tablet, the form of each building, he carries in his heart the image of a city, perceptible as yet only by the intellect.
Or soul, by the way, you could also translate that as
Okay.
soul.
The images of which he stirs up in memory.
Oh, sorry, mind. Mind. Okay, go on.
In memory, which is innate in him, and still further engraving them in his mind like a good workman, keeping his eyes fixed on his model, he begins to raise the city of stones and wood, making the corporeal substances to resemble each of the incorporeal ideas.
Isn't it, you get it? Now, you see how he's very smart in how he uses this model, which gets a very difficult idea across to us in a really concrete way. Mm-hmm. And it's fascinating to me, of course, that the rabbis never read Philo, and yet this midrash I told you about before is virtually identical to this. That just as a king wants to build a palace and needs to get an architect to make plans, so God looked in the Torah, created the Torah, looked in the Torah, and created the world. So this idea, and maybe Philo wasn't the first one to say this, is one that's floating around and eventually ends up in rabbinic midrash hundreds of years later. Read on.
Now, we must form a somewhat similar opinion of God, who, having determined to found a mighty state, first of all conceived its form in his mind, according to which form he made a world perceptible only by the intellect, and then completed one visible to the external senses, using the first one as a model.
There it is. So now we understand what he's talking about.
God's an architect.
Yeah, exactly. And he then goes on in the next paragraph to talk about, he says that just as this plan is stamped in the mind of the workman, so in the same manner neither can the world, which existed in ideas, have any other local position except the divine reason which made them. For what other place could there be for his powers, which should be able to conceive and contain, I do not say it all, but even every single one of them, whatever in its simple form. So the world, it's the same thing. Okay? All right. Let's go on with number 21. Pass it along. I'm going to move
Want to move the
And the power and faculty which could be capable of creating the world has for its origin that good which is founded on truth. For if anyone were desirous to investigate the cause on account of which this universe was created, I think that he would come to no erroneous conclusion if he were to say, as one of the ancients did say, that the Father and Creator was good, on which account he did not grudge the substance a share of his own excellent nature, since it had nothing good of itself, but was able to become everything. For the substance was of itself destitute of arrangement, of quality, of animation, of distinctive character, and full of all disorder and confusion, and received a change and transformation to what is opposite to this condition, and most excellent, being invested with order, quality, animation, resemblance, identity, arrangement, harmony, and everything which belongs to the more excellent idea.
This is right out of the Timaeus, this last part. Okay? So you begin, that's Plato's work on creation. So this is where he's getting this from. There is a primordial, it's like, you're building a building and you got all of the materials all laid out and it's, but then as you build the building, the materials, which just start out as, wood and whatever, begin to be shaped into an order, a structure. So there's this primordial matter, which is without form, chaos, and therefore, he specifically says it is without order. And then it becomes something beautiful. It has this, I'm trying to see if the Greek word, and when it says without order, in fact, the Greek word is actually chaos, which is a Greek word. I can't seem to find it offhand. But the point is that it begins in chaos and ends in cosmos. Right? That cosmos is the opposite of chaos. Mm-hmm. All right. Read another paragraph. And God?
And God, not being urged on by any prompter, for who else could there have been to prompt him, but guided by his own sole will, decided that it was fitting to benefit with unlimited and abundant favors a nature which, without the divine gift, was unable to itself partake of any good thing. But he benefits it not according to the greatness of his own graces, for they are illimitable and eternal, but according to the power of that which is benefited to receive his graces. For the capacity of that which is created to receive benefits does not correspond to the natural power of God to confer them, since his powers are infinitely greater, and the thing created, being not sufficiently powerful to receive all their greatness, would have sunk under it if he had not measured his bounty, allotting to each in due proportion that which was poured upon it.
What is he saying here? There's something really interesting here that I hadn't noticed before. God? Yes, Cal? Or Harvey?
Each to his own?
No?
It's a little bit like building the mortar and the.
But there's an object that he is bestowing his power on, and that object has to receive it.
But the object cannot contain the totality of God's creative power.
Right.
So, creation is an act of limitation of divine power. Think about it. God is infinite. God's creative power is infinite. And therefore, it cannot be totally poured into a form, into a material form.
There's always something left over.
It's not left over. It's just only a small portion of it can be contained. Can be contained. So God has this infinite power of creation, and only part of it is contained within the cosmos. This is a really interesting idea, because what it means is creation itself is an act of divine limitation. Creation cannot represent the totality of God's creative power. God has to limit his own power in order to create a physical universe. This idea is picked up in Kabbalah, where, especially in the 16th century Kabbalistic idea, where of what's called, although it predates it, it's called tzimtzum, which means limitation. That if God is eternal and infinite, where did God put the universe? Within God's own self. Well, how did God do that? God withdraws, as it were, it's always as it were, tzimtzum, and creates a space for creation. So this notion of creation without limitation, that in fact actually goes, from what I understand, originally comes from some Christian theologians. Somehow this idea passes into Kabbalah, but it really shows up in a full-fledged form in the 16th century Lurianic Kabbalah. But when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense logically that it's like, let's go back to the analogy. Not all the ideas of the architect can be contained within the building.
So God has something in the side pocket for later.
Well, it's by God's very nature. God's very nature makes it impossible that all of God is contained within the physical universe. That's a really interesting idea, isn't it? All right, let's go on a little further. And if anyone were,
Where are we now?
number 24.
And if anyone were to desire to use more undisguised terms, he would not call the world, which is perceptible only to the intellect, anything else but the reason of God, already occupied in the creation of the world. For neither is a city, while only perceptible to the intellect, anything else but the reason of the architect, who is already designing to build one perceptible to the external senses on the model of that which is so only to the intellect.
Now this translation translates it as the intellect, which is nothing else than the Word of God, meaning the Logos. This is referring to the Logos, where it says the reason of the architect is the Word of God, when he was already engaged in the act of creation. All right? So, in other words, the only way we know this is through our own mind, our own intellect. Our own mind connects us with this world of the forms that is not the physical world. That's how we perceive of it, because we can't perceive of it using our senses. Because our senses can only perceive the physical world. Read number 25 and we'll stop with that. This is the doctrine.
This is the doctrine of Moses, not mine.
Notice, he has just given us his version of Middle Platonism and its ideas about creation, and he firmly believes that this is what the Torah says. Go on.
Accordingly, he, when recording the creation of man in words which follow, asserts expressly that he was made in the image of God.
Okay, so here is taking the famous passage in Genesis chapter 1, that humans are created in the image of God, but B'Tselem Elohim, whatever it means in the Bible itself, and that's a whole other issue. How is Philo understanding it? He's understanding that the human intellect, the human mind, is what is God-like in us and connects us to the world of God. By the way, Maimonides essentially says the same thing, that the human rational soul is what is godlike about us, because animals don't have it. And that's what in the image of God means. You know, there are many other interpretations of it, but the philosophical understanding of it here says the human mind, which is the only way in which the world of forms can be perceived, is what is godlike about us, because it connects our mind with the divine mind. Finish off the paragraph, and if the image
be a part of the image, then manifestly so is the entire form, namely the whole of this world perceptible by the external senses, which is a greater imitation of the divine image than the human form is. It is manifest also that the archetypal seal, which we call that world which is perceptible only to the intellect, must itself be the archetypal model, the idea of ideas, the reason of God.
here translated as the very word of God.
That's a
The very word of God. So the word, the logos, is the seal. There's an interesting note here. In the newer translation,
Archetypal.
he
It's not
is...
Archetype. You're right, archetype.
I don't know.
No,
I would say
archetype.
All right.
Yeah, archetype.
All right, leave it at that. The point is that we'll stop there, and we'll continue next week with this. We're going to look at some more selections from the creation. You know, if you read through it, he basically goes through Genesis 1 section by section, and then through Genesis 2. We're not going to look at all of it, but we're going to look at a few more sections to understand his idea of creation, and then we're going to go on in the time we have remaining to look at some of his more mystical texts, where he talks about yes, no, these are philosophical. This is cosmology, but he also talks about having this divine experience of a personal relationship with God. I mean, this book, there's more than just this book, which has his cosmological speculations, but this is the one that treats with the first chapter of Genesis. So, we'll see you next week. If I can have the...
yes.
Yes, you can read to us.